session is about the relationship between culture and thought. And what we want to do is sort of build up on the ideas from the previous two sessions. So if you remember, in the first two sessions, I really encouraged you to think about identity and about the roles we play using a sort of theatrical or operatic metaphor, and suggested that, you know, a good way of seeing the communications in which you'll be involved is that all of us adopt and perform within identity positions, and what we see is that those identity positions are performed broadly the same in different, you know, cultural settings, but with small differences, sometimes, you know, larger differences. And if we're aware of the differences in performance, then we're probably pretty adaptable and able to adapt successfully to situations we find ourselves in. And that's a helpful kind of mindset to be in. And that, you know, adaptation is really about the way that we use language. One question, though, is about adaptation. So most people feel that they're adaptable, and yet, nonetheless, when we're in situations managing, you know, often somewhat pressurized situations, where there's a sort of difference in the way that people are performing their roles and using discourse to interact, that can lead to challenges, and, you know, things like culture shock and so on. So this session is really just a short run through of, you know, what is the relationship between our culture, our background, our life experience within a particular social setting and set of interactions and communities or groups that we belong to, and how we think as a product, but also of that setting, but also, you know, as individuals who can think in our own rights, and to what extent, you know, does research suggest that cultural groups that you know, being a product of a particular setting leads to different kinds of thought, and this, you know, hopefully will give you some thoughts about the challenge of being adaptable, because, you know, throughout this I'm going to suggest that being adaptable and flexible is a good thing, is a professional way of approaching intercultural communication, but it's not without challenge, and the reason for that is really that in our cultural or in our own setting, we don't notice culture. It's just there, you know, subconsciously, unconsciously, and it informs our thinking and our decisions without us sort of consciously working through, you know, what is our cultural background? Why do we think, you know, and recognize and know things in the way that we do? So let's try and think of culture in this way. So earlier we looked at it in terms of discourse, communities, and so on. We're going to think of it in terms of our thought processes today. So here's a very simple question. Where is this person from? I pause for a moment so you can make a judgment on that. And I imagine very quickly you looked at this picture and said Scotland. Right? Simple question, Scotland, and so on. And this is how we live our lives. We look at the world, particularly the world that we know, and we make very, very fast judgments. We interpret the situations we see very, very quickly, and for the vast majority of time, very successfully. If we start unpacking that a little bit, there's a skill here that we often don't notice that we have, but actually that allows us to be as successful as we are. So for instance, where is this person from? Notice that my question is about this person, and there are three people here. And it occurs to me that you probably focused on one, not the other. In fact, you probably already got to wedding. You know, this is a wedding and so on. And the person you focused on is probably the man wearing the skirt rather than the woman wearing the dress. Because woman wears dress culturally for us is, you know, pretty unexceptional. That's what in linguistics we talk about as being unmarked. Whereas man wears skirt, you know, reflects a kind of norm that is unusual, right? It's a sort of a breach of a norm. Men don't tend to wear skirts. That's you know, in this setting. So we come up with a narrative to explain the world, which takes us to Scotland broadly. So one of the things that we have that we don't notice is a reservoir of knowledge, a reservoir of our cultural knowledge, or our knowledge that we developed and have built within a particular cultural setting or set of settings, that allows us to look at a picture and go, Scotland, wedding, boom, and on we go. And we make these inferences very, very fast. This reservoir of knowledge that we develop within our cultural setting captures different kinds of knowledge, right? So we have declarative knowledge, you know, stuff that you can say, knowledge that is often taught to us in sort of formal settings and so on. We have procedural knowledge, which is knowledge of how to do things. And often that may reflect professional or educational training. Often procedural knowledge, you know, sort of knowing how to do things is acquired. So we learn it by doing it. You know, nobody particularly sat you down and told you how to manage a post office, but I bet you are good at managing a post office nonetheless, because you just, you know, observed it and you learn by doing. What's particularly interesting to us and thinking about, you know, sort of the knowledge we develop within our cultural setting is what's called tacit knowledge. So knowledge you use without knowing that you're using it. And there are different ways in which we develop this knowledge, you know, through acquisition, through practice, through unconscious application of rules and norms. So when you looked at this, you automatically, I imagine, focused on one of the characters more than the others, because that character is playing with a norm that looks different most of the time. So there's a sort of application of reasoning criteria. You didn't necessarily go, man wears skirt, that's very strange. You probably went, oh, Scotland. But to get there, you must have gone through, there is a norm that is not being followed in the way that I'm used to. This tacit knowledge, this idea that we know stuff, but we don't consciously know that we know it, is quite strange. But actually, if you think about, you know, sort of recent advances in psychology and reasoning and decision-making and so on, a really famous example is Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky's work on thinking fast and slow. You may have read it, you may have heard about it, basis for behavioral economics, for things like nudge and you know, sort of further applications, that kind of thing. And the idea is that we think in two ways. So system one is fast, unconscious or subconscious, depends how you use the word, automatic, you know, tacit. So when you looked at this picture and answered the question, you probably did it really fast, right? It's like, you know, recognition, off you go. And the idea of system one is that we have these rules that we follow, and we follow them so fast we don't even notice. System two, on the other hand, is explicit, conscious, hard work. So this is more associated with where we, you know, sit down and learn something, and there's a textbook, and you get tired with this kind of thinking. System one, you don't get tired because you do it so fast and you do it well in the world. System two is conscious and hard work. You know, your eyes hurt after a while, and your back does, and that kind of thing. Tversky and Kahneman, or Kahneman and Tversky were really, you know, have been interested in, you know, why is it in economic theory that people don't act, you know, as rational choice might tell them, and they're interested in challenges to that. So for instance, this is an example from Thinking Fast and Slow. an individual has been described by a neighbor as, Steve is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. A meek and tidy soul, he has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. And the question is Steve more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? Now, there are two ways you could answer this, right? System one, which is fast thinking, would look at those category attributes or you know, sort of features of this person, and I think referring to most of our experience would say, well, he's more likely to be a librarian. Steve is more likely to be, you know, these fit with librarianship, just as man wears skirt in public at a wedding fits with Scotland. In fact, in the US, Steve is more likely to be a farmer simply because there are far more farmers than there are librarians in the population. So Kahneman, you know, other behavioral economists have been interested in biases, in sort of challenges of reasoning. But actually in Europe, where this kind of focus on heuristic reasoning, so heuristic reasoning is where you think very fast, normally on the basis of one decision criterion, and you make decisions and work that way. So there are, you know, in sort of a more European approach, people like Gerd Gigerenzer in Germany are really interested in this kind of thinking because most of the time it works successfully and allows us lots of free brain capacity, lots of free working memory, because we don't have to stop and think carefully about everything we see. We look at the world, and if it looks the way we expect, we act as we normally do, right? So it's actually a very successful way of managing social demands and interactions in what's called fast and frugal, in a very quick and efficient manner. So the development of this ability to think fast and act quickly requires this reservoir of knowledge, of knowledge based on experience. And of course, that experience is developed within a cultural setting, within a background, right? So we see man in kilt and think Scottish because that's a cultural reference point that we have. There will be people who haven't come across kilts who just won't have that reference point at all. So this reservoir of knowledge that underpins our successful behavior and action in the world, both in terms of what we know, but also our knowledge of how to be in the world, how to act, how to, as I say, think, speak, write, move, behave, and so on. All of that is influenced by the messages and the experiences that we've got from the cultural setting that we grew up in, and the cultural settings that we have interacted in as we've grown and got older and gone into professional, you know, cultures and so on. And coming back to a slide that we looked at previously, you know, we've learned this firstly through, you know, primary socialization within our family unit. So here are two, as we said, two boys learning how to be a good son, the identity position son. And you can see that in these two different settings, what it is to be a good son is captured and very differently. And their behaviors logically will be different as a result of this education. You know, primary socialization is within kinship, within the family system. Secondary socialization is normally within peers and in education and going beyond and so on. So this reservoir of knowledge about stuff, knowledge about how to live, is culturally influenced, is captured within sort of cultural reference points and so on. And there's a sort of, you know, broad theory in sort of cognitive science that uses a Greek word, schema, to sort of capture this sort of world knowledge of the world, ways of understanding the world. Our schema are our mental representations of how things are in the world, and therefore how we should treat them, what we should do about them. And these schema include frames. So I already said frames of reference. So for the LSE, we have the street that the school is on. We have the, you know, the social sciences as a sort of a set of disciplines that make up the intellectual life of the school. We have a crest of a beaver that is associated with hard work and achievement in the world, which is sort of aspirational for the school, and so on. And if you think about the identity positions that we talked about, you know, we're talking about an individual element, a social element, and sort of a manifestation in the world. So the kinds of clothing that goes with the identity position, that kind of thing. So knowledge, what, you know, so declarative knowledge is captured in frames, in sort of these references to frames of reference. And obviously where you come from and the experiences you have will mean that our frames of reference are, you know, sort of differ if you come from very different places and different backgrounds and settings and so on. And then our knowledge how to be in a post office, to use the example from before, is captured in what we call scripts. So we have scripts, just like our opera singers have the libretto, have the script and the wording of the opera to follow. So we have scripts of what to do in different places. So for instance, when we walk into a hotel, as on the left, we already have frames of reference. We know that certain things are going to be involved, and we have scripts, so certain ways to behave. So at the beginning, we know that we should go to the reception desk, and we should explain that we have a reservation. And we have certain frames, certain kinds of knowledge that, you know, of hotel room, of getting your, you know, your laundry done, of, you know, what the minibar is going to involve, that kind of thing. You know, these are our frames and scripts that allow us to navigate hotel very successfully. And if you think about it, the frames and scripts for hotel are then very different to the frames and scripts for underground, right? For taking the tube. There are ways that you'll behave with strangers in the hotel that you probably aren't going to behave with, you know, in the underground. You know, if you're British and you're in the underground, the idea of talking to other people is, you know, it's a shocking idea. So, you know, the frames that we are used to having, this repertoire of frames and scripts that we use in different settings and so on, that allow us to be flexible and appropriate to these different spaces. And that is what we should try and bring into going into intercultural communication settings and managing how we interact successfully with those who have different frames and scripts, because they have they develop their reservoir of knowledge in different cultural settings. So schema, you know, this sort of mental representation of what we know and how we know how to behave in the world and so on, you know, give us the basis on which there are things that we say explicitly, our explicatures, the things that we say, and then there are things that we mean and we understand, our implicatures, our inferences about the world, which is why, as per our last session, British people can say one thing and understand another, and that makes it quite difficult in intercultural settings. You know, so when we say with the greatest respect, if you're British, you understand that what's about to come doesn't necessarily convey an awful lot of respect. But if you hear this and you've got a different, you know, reservoir, a different script of business meeting, and you have a different reference point of showing respect, then your meaning, the meaning that you will draw, the inference you draw, may well be quite different. And that, you know, sort of explicit what we say and implicit what we mean is going to differ in different, you know, cultural settings. So how does this work? So I've tagged to a psychologist, or an article from a psychologist called Richard Nisbet, and in that article there is this distinction, this proposed distinction by Nisbet, and you can decide about that and we could discuss it, about habits of thought. Broadly, the West and the East You know, these are very, very, you know, you can critique already the size of distinctions being offered, but, you know, a sense that in Western tradition taken from sort of Greek heritage and philosophy, there's this habit of categorizing the world into discrete elements. And in the East, following a more Taoist and then Confucian heritage, you know, dissemination through Confucian heritage approach, there's more focus. There are habits of thought to do with relations. And so Nisbet has, you know, done work contrasting different, you know, the effects or the habits associated with different cultural settings, and links to these ideas that you know, cultures can be contrasted. This is a map showing individualism, collectivism, and you can see that Britain and North America, so the US and Canada, would be seen as very individualistic, that we think of, we categorize things into discrete elements, whereas China, you can see here, is seen as more collectivist, more focused on the relations between people and objects and how things work. And so Nisbet has done a range of experiments. This was an elegant experiment, I think, where he gave cameras to American and Japanese students and asked them to take pictures of their classmates. And one of the things that the American students did was they tended, like on the left, to just focus on the individual. Whereas when they reviewed the pictures taken by the Japanese students, they put the person in the environment in which they were. So there was much more background and sense of environment in the Japanese pictures than in the American ones. And he did in different studies, Nisbet and other colleagues looked at grouping tasks. How would you, what would you do? How would you group things? And he found that the US and sort of Western respondents grouped the cow and the chicken as being in the category of living animals. Whereas the Japanese, and there was an extension to Chinese students, grouped the cow and the grass together because of the relationship between the two. And what he found in these kind of grouping tasks was that the US participants were much more likely, in blue, or to be focusing on categorizing discrete items and elements, and the Taiwanese or Japanese, this is just from one study, were much more likely to think in terms of relations between ideas. And this links to different kinds of findings. So here's a few. So more, the first one about memory. So they got students to do memory tasks, and they found that Japanese students could remember things in the background of pictures much better than US students could. Attribution. So there's students were shown this picture of the fish, and when they were actually school children in this case, when they were asked to talk about kind of what was going on, US students focused more on the fish as individuals, whereas the Chinese students were focused more on the fish as groups. And also, the Chinese students were much more likely to see that there's a frog in the bottom near the weeds because they looked at the background, whereas the US students were much more likely not to even notice that there was a frog, and they focused on the fish and the fish as individuals making decisions and acting and so on. So these are just habits of seeing the world, Nisbet would argue, as categorizing into discrete elements, or seeing the world as a set of relationships that then will influence behaviors and expectations around things like business meetings. Or the agreement of contractual terms between parties. In a Western perspective, the agreement of contractual terms would be, this is a, this contract is a discrete item on its own. Each of the terms of the contract need to be honored in the way that they're written down discretely, and so on. Whereas it may be the case, if you think about the studies we looked at previously about expectations around business meetings, it may be the case that the contract is seen by Chinese participants as part of a wider relationship between parties, which needs to be based on trust and reciprocal regard and guanxi, rather than looking at the contract itself as standing in its own right. So when you, if you choose to look at the reading, then you'll see that there's this suggestion that these habits of thought potentially lead to different kinds of expectations about how to go about things, how to do things, how to conduct interactions. That is then captured in, for instance, parent talk and the lessons we learn early, and the reservoir of knowledge that underpins the way we act in the world unconsciously or subconsciously. And our real challenge is that sometimes, if you think about these lessons about thinking for yourself or doing what's best for the family, if that US young man goes into a Japanese context, it's likely that he will experience different behaviors, different priorities being allocated. And it's really important, I think, for him to be able to stop and say, okay, I understand, this is different. I'm experiencing difference and some emotion that goes with that, but that's okay. Things are just, these identity positions are just performed differently here. And that's all right. That's just different. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And if I want to be successful in this interaction, I will do things differently. I will judge things differently. I will attribute different meanings to things. And then the same needs to be the other way. Given the way the world is, more and more similarity is developing. More and more awareness of difference and understanding of difference is developing. Still, sometimes in the moment, when a person does a thing in a particular way that makes sense to them, it can cut back to early experiences in our childhoods where, we've internalized values and beliefs to such an extent that we get a bit of a shock. And it's really important to be able to note the shock, be calm, and then decide to be flexible. And that, is the intention of the reading, understanding that our thought processes are habits of thought, and those habits of thought have been influenced by our cultural background and our experiences of life and those around us. If we're open to new habits of thought and habits of expression and ways of behaving, then we're much more likely to be successful in the new settings that we find ourselves in.